Hello again, friends, and welcome to another amazing story. In this episode, we'll be listening to the story of Jack and the barren alien Princess Cora. Sit back and get ready to dive into a science fiction dream. Enjoy. The alien princess was rejected by all the nobles because she was infertile, except for one person, the human man. Cora had decided long ago, exactly 4 kinds of silence in the Hall of Suits, and she had learned to identify each one before she was halfway across the floor. There was the silence of a room that had not yet noticed her, which was rare and rather pleasant. There was the silence of a room that had noticed her and was pretending otherwise, which involved a great deal of sudden interest in the ceiling frescoes. There was the silence of pity, wet and heavy, like walking through warm laundry. And there was tonight's silence, the 4th and finest vintage, the silence of a room that already knew how the evening would end and was politely waiting for her to catch up. She crossed it at an unhurried pace, coral-toned hands folded, the long sweep of her ears bare of any jewel, because the house of Siren considered ear ornament vulgar, and one did not insult a house before the soup. The candlefish drifting in their glass columns along the walls pulsed a soft gold as she passed, tuned by some ancestor with more money than restraint to brighten for royal blood. They brightened for her, too. The candlefish, at least, had never read a healer's report. Her father, King Theodore, was already seated beneath the loom, that vast hanging lattice of filament and light that mapped 900 years of Vaelen descent, every line a marriage, every node a birth, the whole shimmering thing updating itself in real time like a stock exchange for wombs. Somewhere in the lower left, a small unlit node marked her. It had been unlit for 26 years. The loom was very patient about it, in the way that a creditor is patient. "Cora," her father said warmly, which meant behave. "Father," she said warmly, which meant I am always behaving. That's the problem. Lord Adrian of Siren rose and offered a bow of the exact depth prescribed for an unbetrothed daughter of the first house, no deeper, and Cora felt the evening close over her head like water. He was handsome in the manner of a well-maintained monument. He asked after her health. She said her health was robust, thank you, and watched him flinch at the word, because health was the whole battlefield, and they both knew it. And she had a small, cruel habit of firing the first shot herself just to feel like a participant. Dinner came in 11 courses. The suit was withdrawn somewhere around the 7th. Not allowed. Never allowed. But in the small, ceremonial shift of Adrian's wine cup from her side of the table to his mother's, a gesture so old and so refined that half the guests sighed with satisfaction at seeing it done properly. Nobody looked at Cora. Everybody looked at Cora. She ate her fish. It was then that a voice from the far end of the table, down past the salt, past the minor attachés, down among the potted ferns where they exiled the truly unimportant, said with real heat, "That's not how orbits work." The hall performed a small collective spasm. The speaker was a human. Cora had been informed of him earlier in the day the way one is informed of weather. A trade envoy, from a station whose name nobody in the room could locate on a chart, present at the dinner because protocol required a chair for anyone who signed a grain tariff. He had round little ears pinned flat to the sides of his head, which gave him the look of something recently startled, and he was jabbing a fork at Baron Ellis, who had made the mistake of describing the moon ferry delays as a scheduling failure. "It's not scheduling," the human said. "You're burning at the wrong point in the orbit. You're speeding up to catch something ahead of you, which drops you into a higher, slower path, so you arrive later, and then you burn again to fix it, which makes it worse. And then you write a very stern letter to the ferry captain. I've read the letters. They're beautiful. They're also blaming a man for geometry." "And your name," said Cora, from the other end of the table, before she had entirely decided to speak. "Jack," he said. "Jack, you're wrong." "I'm frequently wrong," Jack said cheerfully, "but not tonight. You're wrong because you've assumed a two-body problem. Vaelen has a second moon. Small, dark, ill-tempered. We don't put it on the tourist charts because it makes the sky look untidy. Every ferry path in this system is a 3-body resonance, and if you burn where you're suggesting, You don't arrive late. You arrive in pieces. There was a pause of the kind that has weight. Huh, said Jack. He sat back. He looked for a moment, honestly wounded, the way a man looks when the universe has taken something from him. That's annoying. Most true things are. No, I mean it's personally annoying. I spent 4 days on that argument. I had a diagram. He picked up his wine, considered it, and pointed the glass at her like an accusation. Where do I find the resonance data? Down the table, Lord Adrian's mother inhaled through her nose in a manner that had ended careers, and Cora, who had entered the hall knowing precisely what the silence meant, who had come armed for pity and found herself instead being scolded about lunar mechanics by a man eating fish with the wrong fork, heard herself say, "The Observatory Archive. 3rd tier. It's badly catalogued." By whom? By me. Then it's probably fine and you're being modest, which I'm told is a court disease. Is it curable? Fatal, usually, said Cora. Slowly. He laughed. It was an unrefined noise, entirely wrong for the room, and it went up into the shining lattice of the loom and came back down again, and nobody at that table, not her father, not Adrian, not the candlefish, noticed the one truly remarkable thing about the entire evening, which was that in 2 full hours of conversation, the human had not once asked her about children. He came back 11 days later with a grain tariff. It was, Cora was assured by the Chamberlain, the dullest document ever to cross the threshold of the palace. 40 pages concerning the reclassification of husked versus unhusked millet for the purposes of orbital transit duty, an object so tedious that 2 clerks had asked to be reassigned rather than read it aloud. The Chamberlain delivered this news in the tone of a man reporting a death in the family. Cora read the tariff in 9 minutes. 8 of them were spent on the margins, where someone had written, in cramped human script beside a paragraph about sack weights, "This clause is a crime against sacks." He came back again after that with a customs schedule, and then with an amendment to the customs schedule, and then with a formal apology for the amendment, which required its own visit. By the 4th month, the court had developed a name for it. They called it the millet business, and they said it the way one says the weather, which is to say with the assumption that it would eventually stop. What nobody in the marble halls could adequately explain was why the millet business kept requiring the presence of the princess. Cora could not have explained it either, except that Jack asked her things. Not the ceremonial things, not how do you find the season or is your father well, but things with edges. What was the mass driver on the northern Cape rated for? Whether the tide gauges in the southern sea had ever been recalibrated after the quake. Why a civilization with 900 years of astronomy had never put a permanent eye above its own atmosphere. He asked these the way other men asked for directions, with a sort of impatient hunger, and when she answered, he did not do the thing every noble in Vaelen did, which was to look pleased on her behalf, as though she had performed a small trick. So when he asked, in the 5th month, whether she had really built an observatory, she took him to it largely to make him stop. It stood 11 kilometers out from the capital on a spur of black rock the map-makers had never bothered to name, and it looked, in the failing light, like something the sea had spat up and the land had declined to accept. Cora had designed it at 19. She had walked out of it at 23 and had not gone back, and the door knew her hand anyway, which she found unforgivable of the door. Inside, the dust lay in drifts. The great mirror hung on its cradle under a shroud gone gray, and in the crook of the Polar Drive assembly, where a very expensive Barren had once lived, there was a nest. The bird occupying it was a rock crake, about the size of a soup tureen, and it regarded them with the flat and total hostility of a landlord who has found strangers in his kitchen. "Ah," said Jack. "Squatters. Don't. I'm just going to move it a little." The rock crake went for his hand with a sound like a hinge being murdered. Jack retreated across the floor at a speed Cora would not have credited, holding his wrist and saying several words that the translator declined to render, offering instead a small chime and the note, idiomatic. "That's my Barren housing," he said, wounded. "It's my Barren housing. It's hers now, apparently, and she's not renting." He sucked his knuckle and squinted up into the dark where the mirror hung. Cora, this is enormous. It's adequate. It is not adequate. It's obscene. You could see a coin on the third moon with this. You have 3 moons, don't you? Or is the third one also too untidy for the charts? 2 moons and an embarrassment. And you left it. He said it without accusation, which was worse. He was turning slowly on the spot, looking up, and there was something almost indecent about the way he looked at things, as if he had never been taught that looking too long was rude. Why? The truthful answer was that at 23 she had understood, finally and completely, what the healer's report meant for the rest of her life, and had discovered she could no longer look at anything very far away, without it feeling like a taunt. What she said was, funding. Liar. Envoy. You had a king. Kings are famously funded. He grinned at her, entirely unbothered, and turned back to the mirror. Fine. Keep it. Show me the survey data instead. The resonance set you shouted at me about at dinner. I want to see how badly I was wrong. I want to savor it. So they dug it out, because it was easier than continuing the other conversation. 3rd tier, badly catalogued, exactly as promised. 9 years of sky. 600,000 plates, tagged in a private shorthand that Cora had invented at 20 and could still read with humiliating fluency. They spread it across the old table with the lamps hauled close, and the rock crake supervised, and outside the sea went about its business. It was Jack, 3 hours in, dusty to the elbows and chewing on a stylus like a man raised by wolves, who said, "What's this one doing?" "Which?" "This. Outer archive, high inclination. You've tagged it twice, 9 years apart, and it's not where it ought to be. It's moved wrong." Cora leaned over. It was a smudge. It was a nothing, a bad plate, a cosmic ray, a fleck of grit on a 19-year-old girl's lens. She had catalogued 10,000 of them. "Plate defect," she said. "It's in 2 plates. Then 2 plate defects. It happens. The coating flaked." Cora. He was not grinning now, which was somehow much more alarming than when he was. "It's the same defect in both. 9 years apart. On different coatings. Moving on a curve." "Then it's a comet, and it's long gone, and it is late, Jack, and you have a tariff in the morning." He let her put the plate away. He let her lock the door, and he made a joke about the Crake's tenancy agreement all the way down the Black Rock to the car, and he did not mention it again that night, which ought to have been the end of it. That was the part Cora would come back to afterwards, that he had smiled and let it go, and that she had believed him. The court did not object. That would have required saying something aloud, and Vaelen had spent 900 years perfecting the art of objecting with furniture. It began with the seating. At the feast of the second tide, Jack's chair was moved from the ferns to a small table by the door, at which were also seated a deaf archivist and a boy who fed the candlefish. At the next reception, the small table was gone altogether, and a note arrived explaining with enormous regret that the hall was under repair. The hall was not under repair. The hall had been standing since before humans had discovered soap, and everyone knew it. And that was the point. The lie was meant to be visible. A lie you could see through was a courtesy. It meant we are not even going to bother deceiving you, because you are not worth the effort of deception. "They've moved me into a corridor," Jack reported, delighted, dropping onto the observatory step with a bag of hot-fried millet. "There's a draft. A duke walked past me twice and looked directly through my skull. I think I'm becoming a ghost. Do you have a ceremony for that?" "Several. They're expensive." "Of course they are." He offered her the bag. The rock crake, who had recently and disgracefully been bought off with fried millet, came down from her bearing housing and stood between them like a chaperone with a criminal record. What Cora did not tell him was that it had stopped being funny 4 days earlier, in council, when Lord Adrian rose to speak on the subject of human trade access, with the air of a man performing a public service. Adrian had once withdrawn his own suit for her hand. He had done it beautifully, a letter of such exquisite construction that she still, on certain nights, remembered whole sentences. "The House of Siren will not ask of your Highness what your Highness cannot give." He had signed it with condolences, as one does for a death. And now, Watching the human envoy be permitted the corridors of the palace, Adrian had discovered in himself a passionate concern for the integrity of Vaelen's borders, because it was one thing to refuse a woman, and quite another to watch someone else decline to. He did not name Jack. He spoke of irregular access, of undocumented influence, of the wisdom of reviewing all standing envoy credentials before the season's end. The council murmured. The loom shimmered overhead, updating itself, indifferent. 2 days after that, her father sent for Jack alone. Cora learned the details later, in pieces, mostly from a clerk who had been in the antechamber and had the moral fiber of a wet paper bag. Theodore had begun with money, a settlement, phrased as a trade concession, generous enough to buy the envoy's entire station and repaint it. Jack had asked whether the offer was per annum, been told it was not, and said good, because that would have been insulting, which the clerk had needed a full minute to work out. Then the title. A minor lordship on the western coast, land attached, a house with a roof that only occasionally participated. Jack had said he'd want to see the roof. Then, at last, the other thing, delivered in the flat voice Theodore used perhaps twice a decade, that envoys had been recalled for less, that stations dependent on Vaelen grain were fragile things, and that a man far from home should consider how far. And Jack, according to the clerk, who was by this point enjoying himself far too much, had thought about it, and then said, "Your Majesty, I genuinely can't tell which of those was supposed to work." Theodore had dismissed him. Then he had sat alone in the room for some time, because a man who cannot find another man's price cannot map him, and Theodore had built a reign on maps. Cora heard all this and felt something rise in her chest that she recognized with real horror as hope. She went to the observatory that evening and waited for him with the lamps lit, and when he came up the black rock with his ridiculous bag of millet and his ridiculous round ears pink with cold, she said, before he could speak, "Sit down, I'm going to tell you something, and then you're going to leave." "That's a terrible opening. Try again." "The healers of the first house examined me at 17. She said it in their voice. She had spent 9 years learning their voice the way other women learned languages. Ovarian architecture incomplete. Uterine lining non-viable. No corrective pathway exists in current medicine and none is projected. Conclusion: the subject cannot continue the line. That's the phrase, Jack. Not she cannot have children. The subject cannot continue the line. They read it aloud to my father while I stood there. I was 17, and I was standing in the room, and they said the subject. The wind came up off the sea and moved through the dark above them. "So," she said, "now you have it. Every man in that court had the decency to withdraw at this point, and they did it in writing, and one of them sent condolences. You've been offered money and land and a threat, and you've refused all three, and I cannot for the life of me work out what you think you're doing here. But whatever it is, it ends tonight. Go home. Go be a ghost in someone else's corridor." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "Cora," he said, "do you actually want me to go? Or do you want to have said it? Go." So he went. He set the millet down on the step and said good night to the crake by name, and went down the black rock into the dark and did not look back, because she had asked him not to, and he was, infuriatingly, a man who listened. The observatory light stayed on all night. She found it herself, which was the cruelty of it. 9 nights alone in the observatory with nothing to do but not think about a man, and a woman of Cora's temperament will always reach for the nearest arithmetic. She pulled the plate, then the other plate. Then, because it refused to be a defect, 400 more, and she sat in the cold with the drift of dust and the crake asleep in the bearing housing, and watched a smudge she had dismissed at 19 resolve, over 9 hours, into an object. It had mass. It had an orbit. The orbit had been decaying for centuries with the exquisite patience of a thing nobody was watching, and it was now, in the way of all patient things, nearly finished. She ran the fall 3 times because she did not believe it, and once more because she did. 11 days. And the ground track, when she laid it over the map, went through the capital the way a needle goes through cloth, through the hall of suits, through the loom, through the 700,000 people who were at that moment asleep beneath it and dreaming about millet. She sent for Jack at 4 in the morning. He arrived at 5 wearing his coat inside out, having been in the corridor. You said go home. I've changed my mind. Sit down. You people have no consistency. Sit down. He looked at the screen. He stopped talking, which she had not previously believed possible, and she watched a man she had classified as fundamentally unserious go somewhere else behind the eyes and come back holding a rank he had never mentioned. Mass estimate? Between 4 and 9 million tons. The plates aren't good enough. Then we go and look, Jack said. Because if it's 4, we can nudge it, and if it's 9, we can't. And the difference is whether your father evacuates a city in 11 days or a continent. There is no ship on this world rated for a rendezvous at that inclination. There's a mining tug at the northern cape with 2/3 of a drive and a hull like a dropped kettle, and the man who owns it owes me money. He was already standing. Also, I should mention, in the interests of honesty, that my flight certification was suspended. For what? For doing more or less this. The council took 6 hours and Adrian took 4 of them, which was the closest that man ever came to killing anybody. But Theodore looked at his daughter's numbers, and then at his daughter, and gave the order. And that was how Cora came to be strapped into a mining tug named Buttercup beside a human who sang while he burned retrograde, badly and out of tune, and entirely on purpose because she had told him it made her want to open the airlock. They matched with it on the 3rd day. It was not a comet. It was not an asteroid. It was 900 meters of hull with the ribs of a spin section still turning, slow and sick, and along the flank in letters 4 stories tall, blistered by 9 centuries of sun, was a word in old Vaelen that Cora had only ever seen carved over tombs. Siran. The long patience. The Ark. The first ship. The one that every child in Vaelen was taught had burned to nothing in the sky above the landing, which was why there was nothing left of it, which was why nobody had ever gone to look. Cora, said Jack, very quietly. Your face is doing something. Doc, she said. The airlock knew her. That was the first wrong thing. 900 years of vacuum, and the mechanism read her palm and opened like a door in her own house. The lights came up in a long amber wave down a corridor built for people who had been taller than anyone alive, and a voice, dry as a dead leaf, said, Crew rotation 71. You are 11 hours late. Again. Jack's hand went to his sidearm and Cora caught his wrist. There is soup, said the shipmind. There is always soup. I have been making soup for 406 years, and I would like someone to acknowledge that. Ship, said Cora. What year do you have? 9th of the crossing. A pause. Something ticked, deep in the walls, like a clock clearing its throat. I am aware that is incorrect. I have been aware for some time. I find it more comfortable than the alternative, and I would thank you not to argue with me before breakfast. That's fair, said Jack. That's honestly fair. I do that. They worked for 11 hours in the dark and the amber light, hauling the engine survey, and the shipmind talked at them the whole time about crew who had been dust before Vaelen had an alphabet, and offered soup at intervals, and Cora found the mass figure, 6,400,000 tons, which was the worst possible number, the number that meant maybe. Somewhere around the 8th hour, wedged upside down in a conduit with Jack holding the light and complaining about her elbows, she realized. He had had 5 months. 5 months of corridors and tariffs and fried millet, of a king offering him land, of a court moving his chair, of her standing on a black rock at night reciting the subject cannot continue the line, and in all of it, in every hour of it, he had never once asked her the question. Not gently, not cruelly, not even to get it out of the way. It had simply never occurred to him that it was a question. Cora, said Jack, you've stopped. I know. Is it the ship? No, she said into the dark, to a 900-year-old wall. It's much worse than the ship. The archive was in the spin section. Behind a door the shipmind opened without being asked, muttering that it had been trying to show someone this for 4 centuries, and that the crew never listened. Never. Not once. Not even about the soup. Inside were the founding records of Vaelen. Not the copies. Not the illuminated recensions in the Hall of Suits with their gold leaf and their careful genealogies. The originals. Manifests. Medical logs. The thing itself. Cora read for 40 minutes without moving. The crew of the Siren had numbered 904. Every one of them had been built for the crossing. Bones thickened, marrow rewritten, and because a closed hull cannot survive 6 generations of accident and appetite, reproduction removed entirely. Not damaged, designed out. Sterility had been a specification, listed on page 11 between radiation tolerance and dietary efficiency, in the flat font of an engineer with a schedule. The children had come from the vault, 900,000 cell lines held in the keel, drawn and grown and raised in common, parentage recorded as ship. There had been no bloodlines. There had never been bloodlines. The founders of Vaelen, the sacred first houses, the pure descent, the 900 years of marriages arranged like surgery, had every one of them been barren by design and had raised each other's children in a cold hull and called it enough. The loom was 300 years old. Somebody had invented it. Somebody had needed a reason to be obeyed. "Cora," Jack said. "Say something. You're frightening the ship." "She is not frightening me," said the ship mind. "I have seen this face before. It is the face they all made. I gave them soup." "I'm not a flaw," Cora said. "No. I am the original condition." She heard her own voice go strange and thin, and she did not stop it. "Every healer who ever wrote the subject cannot continue the line, Jack. I am the line. I'm what they were. They put me at the bottom of that lattice as the broken node, and the entire lattice is a forgery." "I am extremely sorry," said the ship mind, "but your window has moved." It had. The tug's telemetry had been recomputing while they read, and the number that came up was obscene. The burn window had shortened by 9 hours, because the resupply barge Cora had requisitioned out of the Northern Cape had been held at the tariff office for a documentation review, signed, the clerk had helpfully retained the seal, by the office of Lord Adrian of Siren, in the interests of procedural integrity. "He's delayed our fuel," Jack said, "with paperwork. He's a Siren. It's how they hunt. I want it on record that I find that magnificent." Jack was already at the console, scrolling. "Right. We can't burn long, so we burn hard, which means both mains at 90 and the throttle held open past the point where the ship starts having opinions. Ship, can you run it?" My command lattice was cut in the 4th century by a crew who did not trust me. I retained soup. I did not retain thrust. "Manual, then." Someone stands in the drive gallery holding the interlock open. "And the gallery is inside the shielding," said Cora. "For 9 minutes, at 90%. "Right." Jack straightened up and rolled his shoulders and said with terrible cheerfulness, "Well, good news is I've always wanted to be a father, and this'll settle the question permanently." She hit him. Not hard and not well, and it landed on his arm rather than his face, and he laughed at her, which was worse. "That is not funny." "It's a little funny. 9 minutes will kill you, Jack. 9 minutes will kill anyone. It's 4.5 each, and neither of us dies, and we both spend a fortnight being sick in a very undignified way." He said it lightly, and then he stopped saying it lightly. "You can do the maths faster than me, and I can hold a lever. That's the whole partnership. I'm not going in there alone, and neither are you, so please stop trying to be noble. It doesn't suit either of us." So, they did it badly. Together. Which was how they did everything. Cora took the first shift because she was smaller, and the gallery had been built for people 4 centuries taller than her. The interlock was a bar of cold iron, and it fought her, and the light through the shielding gaps came up violet and wrong, and she counted her own heartbeat and thought quite calmly, "The subject cannot continue the line," and then, with something like joy, "No. The subject is what the line was." Jack took the second. He sang through it. She could hear him over the drive, flat and tuneless and defiant, some human song about a girl and a harbor, and she stood at the hatch with her hands shaking and screamed the count at him, and at 4 minutes and 40 seconds she hauled him out by the collar, and they lay together on the deck plating while the Saran groaned and swung and slid ponderously, magnificently, off the neck of the world. "Trajectory nominal," said the shipmind after a while. "Crew rotation 71. You are 11 hours late." "We know," said Jack into the floor. "There is soup." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, all right. Bring the soup." They were both, as promised, extremely sick for 11 days, and in a manner so undignified that no chronicler of Vaelen would ever be permitted to write it down. Cora lost the hearing in one ear for a fortnight and most of her hair by the second month, and Jack developed a tremor in his left hand that never entirely went away, so that for the rest of his life he could not carry a full cup of anything across a room without narrating an apology to it. They convalesced in adjoining rooms of the West Wing, and shouted at each other through the wall about orbital elements, and the palace physicians reported to the king that both patients were recovering well, and that the noise was, medically speaking, a good sign. Theodore came on the 6th day with the archive under his arm. He had read it. That was plain from his face, which had aged the way stone ages, all at once and along an existing fault. He sat down at the foot of his daughter's bed, a thing he had not done since she was small, and he said, "There is a version of this in which the Saran's records are sealed to the first house, and the world is told a comet was diverted by the courage of the crown." "Yes," said Cora. "There is. It would cost nothing. It would preserve everything. It would preserve the loom, father. It would not preserve anything that deserves the word everything." He was quiet for a while. He was a man who had built a reign out of maps, and he had just been shown that the map had been drawn 300 years ago by frightened men with a motive, and that his own daughter had been filed as an error on it since she was 17 while he stood in the room and let them say the subject. "I signed that report," he said. "I have never told you that. There is a line at the bottom for the parent, and I signed it, and I did not read it first because I could not bear to." "I know," said Cora. "I saw it." "I would like," said Theodore, with enormous difficulty, "to be a better king than I have been a father. It is a low bar, and I intend to clear it." He published the archive entire, not a summary, the manifests, the medical logs, page 11 with its flat engineer's font, the vault records with 900,000 cell lines listed under parentage, ship. He read the founding specification aloud himself beneath the loom, to a hall so silent that the candlefish could be heard turning in their columns, and when he had finished, he ordered the lattice unwound. It took 4 days. They kept the filament. It was made of something the Ark had spun and nobody now knew how to make. It hangs in the public archive today with a card beneath it explaining in plain language what it was for. The House of Siren did not survive the month. It was not exile or seizure or anything so dramatic. It was simply that Siren's entire claim to precedence had rested on the purity of a descent that was now a matter of public record as a fiction, and their creditors, who had extended terms on the strength of a bloodline, read the news at breakfast. Adrian made one speech in council about procedural integrity, and the seal on the tariff hold, which the clerk had retained, was read into the minutes immediately after it. He retired to the western coast. Cora is reliably informed that the roof only occasionally participates. The succession was rewritten that autumn. Heirship by nomination and competence, ratified by council. The old formula about issue of the body struck out with a single line of ink by a king who did it himself and then had to sit down. Cora was named. She is still, medically speaking, exactly what the healers said she was at 17. That sentence simply stopped being a sentence, in the judicial sense, and became a fact about her body of no more consequence than her height. And Jack still had not asked. She noticed it in the spring, in the observatory, which had been swept and remirrored and refunded, and was now infested with graduate students, and one increasingly outraged rock crake. He was up on the gantry with the polar drive housing open, having lost the bearing argument permanently and for all time, and he was complaining about the crake's tenancy, and Cora thought, he is never going to ask me, not because he is being delicate, because it has genuinely never entered his head. So she climbed the gantry and asked him instead. He went scarlet. Humans do that. It is undignified, and she has never tired of it. and dropped a spanner 11 meters onto the floor of her observatory and said, "Yes, obviously. God, yes. Cora, I've been trying to work out how to bring it up for 2 years without it sounding like I wanted something from you. And what do you want?" "To keep arguing with you," Jack said. "That's it. That's the whole thing. I want to be losing an argument with you when I'm 90. I want to be wrong at you for the rest of my life." The Crake screamed at both of them. They took it as a blessing. Out beyond the second moon and the embarrassment, the Saran holds a stable, patient orbit, tended by an old ship mine that is finally, formally, on the record, thanked for the soup, visible on clear nights as a slow, bright point crossing the sky above Vaelen. The children point at it. They are told the truth about it. It is a very good star to have, high enough to be looked at and far enough to keep nobody living in it. 900 years, a whole civilization arranged itself around a single question, and it was the wrong question. They built halls for it. They hung a lattice of light above their king and let it decide, node by node, who was worth marrying and who was worth mourning. And it was a forgery, not a malicious one at first. Just frightened people, 3 centuries back, who needed a reason to be obeyed, and found one, and let it harden. That is the quiet horror of it. Nobody in that hall was cruel. They were courteous. They withdrew their suits in beautiful handwriting. They sent condolences. They moved a wine cup 6 inches across a table and called it mercy, and every one of them went home believing they had behaved well. Cora spent 9 years believing them. That is the part that should stay with you. Not the ark, not the burn, not the star. A woman with the sharpest mind in her father's council, who could hold 3 moons in her head at once, could not hold the idea that she was not broken. Because a verdict repeated often enough stops sounding like an opinion and starts sounding like weather. And what freed her was not love. Let us be precise, because she would insist on it. What freed her was evidence. A 900-year-old page with a flat engineer's font on it, saying that the thing she'd been condemned for was the condition her whole world had been founded in. Jack did not rescue her. Jack simply failed, for 2 entire years, to ask the question everyone else had asked first. He was the one man who never checked her paperwork. And it turned out that being unaudited by one person for long enough is what gives you the nerve to go and read the archive yourself. So here is what the story leaves you holding. Somewhere in your life there is a loom, a lattice you did not build, hanging over a room you did not choose, quietly sorting you, by what you earn, by what you've produced, by whether you married, by whether you stayed married, by what your body has or hasn't done. And you have probably learned, as she did, to walk into certain rooms already knowing what the silence means. Ask yourself, who wrote that verdict? Not who repeated it. Who wrote it? Is there a page 11 you've never gone and read for yourself? And ask the harder one, the one that cost the king of Vaelen more than losing his dynasty. Whose report have you signed at the bottom without reading, because you could not bear to? There is someone in your life waiting for you to ask about their work instead of their status. It costs nothing. It is the cheapest thing in this story, and the only thing in it that actually saved anybody. The ark burns over Vaelen every clear night, high enough to look at, far enough that nobody has to live in it. That's the trick with the past, isn't it? Not to destroy it, just to get it far enough away that it stops falling on the city. The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Jack and Cora's wonderful story. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to hit the like button below, leave your thoughts about the story in the comments, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you in the next story, friends.